Just this week, we got a major look into the Canadian government's financial plans for the year to come, resetting what they had previously promised, axing previous plans, while focusing on two very specific areas. And this new plan is majorly controversial even within the Liberal Party itself, with some people who are close to the situation saying that Canada is trying to drive the economy with one foot on the gas and one foot on the brake at the very same time. And there was a meeting just this week where all of the different finance ministers from every individual province came to Ottawa to meet with Chrystia Freeland, the federal finance minister, and this is where we got all the insight. I'll show you a clip and then we're going to get into it in more depth.
As finance ministers, all of us around the table, we're very aware of the uncertainty in the global economy right now. Inflation is high and interest rates are high. Things are tough for a lot of Canadians and a lot of Canadian families today. And at the federal level, this is a time of real fiscal constraint. We know that one of the most important things the federal government can do to help Canadians today is to be mindful of our responsibility not to pour fuel on the fire of inflation, not to force the Bank of Canada to raise rates even higher.
So she's saying, whoa guys, we really need to rein in the amount that we as a government are spending right now to make sure we don't pour fuel on the fire of inflation. And this directly maps to a warning that the Canadian government received from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, back in October, where they warned this very same thing. In this section of this report, they say that fiscal policy in Canada should support the fight against inflation. Revenue windfalls at both the federal and provincial levels should be saved. And while some space could be made for limited and extremely highly targeted programs to help vulnerable households from the high fuel prices and food price inflation we're seeing, that more generalized spending increases should be avoided so as to not undercut monetary policy. The IMF also told Canada that we need to focus on reducing our deficit, decreasing the amount that we spend as a country on next year's budget, which we're probably going to get in April of 2023, and making sure that this is used to rein in inflation and bring down the Canadian government's debt as quickly as possible. And it seems like the federal government is following this game plan to a T. Since this warning came down from the IMF, the Canadian government has really only provided very targeted and very limited supports to help Canadians, with people in the lowest income bracket receiving like at a max around $1,000 from both a doubling of the GST rebate as well as a very limited housing benefit that went out to Canada's most vulnerable renters. But these promises to only spend in very limited ways effectively reset some of the promises that the government has previously made to overhaul the social safety net systems in Canada, like employment insurance and the new disability benefit. This directly contradicts the goals the government previously put forward. After an election, the Prime Minister sends letters to all of the people in his cabinet, the ministers that are responsible for individual tasks, and this is the one that he sent to the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Disability Inclusion, Carla Qualtrough. In this letter, Trudeau tells his ministers what they need to be responsible for based on the promises that were made in the campaign that got him elected back in 2021. And for Carla Qualtrough, he says, by summer 2022, I want you to bring forward and begin implementing a plan to modernize the EI system for the 21st century. He also points out that the Canada Disability Inclusion Action Plan needs to be finalized and released, and this has sort of resulted in the Canada Disability Benefit, a new program that has made its way through the House of Commons. This revolutionary new EI program that was supposed to be done by summer 2022, well, we haven't seen any kind of legislation tabled up until this point that points to what this new EI program actually is. And for the Canada Disability Benefit, this legislation has made it almost all the way through the parliamentary system, but once this bill comes into effect, it actually doesn't mean that there's a benefit that's being provided for Canadians. It just means that now there's a 1-year deadline on providing regulations for how this bill could work in the future. But my point is that given these new statements that we just heard from Chrystia Freeland, it's far less likely that the government will do any serious work on these issues or any serious work on issues that would require dramatic spending from the government in order to bring it into effect, with Freeland heeding this advice from the IMF as to not spend too much unless she add more fuel to the inflationary fire. But Freeland has committed to spend in two very specific areas in Canada, which we'll get to in just a moment. But first, it seems that even this aggressive move towards spending less in Canada, even that announcement from Freeland, is not enough in the eyes of some former Liberal figures, including a previous Liberal finance minister and deputy prime minister, John Manley. Here's a clip of what he recently said in an interview, and I think it's going to be rather surprising coming from a Liberal talking about another Liberal in this way.
I think we would both agree that at the moment, at least, it appears that fiscal and monetary policy are not aligned. And the importance of that alignment is key. We're still running very large fiscal deficits. The government still talks about how much they're going to continue to spend. And this is a bit like driving your car with one foot on the gas and the other on the brake. Generally, especially if there's sloshy conditions under your tires, that's not a good plan for controlling the direction of your vehicle. Not a good plan for controlling the direction of the economy either.
So even though Freeland said she's planning on limiting spending, Manley thinks that it's not enough, saying that we're still projected to spend way more as a government than we're bringing in as a government, creating a deficit, right? Suggesting that anything less than a balanced budget is not enough to reduce the chance of inflation from government spending. But despite warnings from the man who had the exact same job that she has as finance minister and deputy PM, Freeland says that she's now committed to spending more money on two specific areas. Listen to this.
Now is a time when there are two big areas that are calling out for federal investment. One is healthcare. I think it is clear to all Canadians that we need to invest in our healthcare system. And we made commitments during the election campaign to do so, and we will honor those commitments. The other area that is really calling out for investment is building the clean economy of the 21st century. We've started that work. We said in the fall economic statement we would be investing even more in the budget, and we will do so because we must. The alternative is really for Canada to be left out, and I think everyone would agree that is not an alternative.
So the first focus, healthcare funding, that could be an entire video in and of itself, with provinces and the federal government sort of being at a stalemate with how we can improve the healthcare system in Canada. The Prime Minister is set, however, to have a big meeting next week to determine what's happening in this space. But what she also mentions is the second area of spending that they'll focus on, which is creating the new clean economy of the 21st century. Now, we've heard this kind of terminology before, talking about the just transition or creating a green economy. Now, based on recent announcements from the government, it seems that this means kind of trying to create more manufacturing jobs for the production of green vehicles and vehicle parts, as well as increasing mining for minerals that are going to be important for batteries, both for electric cars and for more of an electricity-based economy leading into the future. But some critics say that this focus on only the green industry of the future is easy to sell to your voters as being good, but at the very same time narrows the scope too much on what the economy of tomorrow actually looks like. Instead of making Canada a better place to build startups and new Canadian native businesses that develop their own intellectual property, Canada seems to be far more focused on increasing jobs numbers. Now, in a moment, we'll talk about why creating jobs isn't good enough on its own and how that focus could actually make Canadians' lives worse over the long term. But first, in an example of how the Canadian government seems to be shortchanging new developing sections of the Canadian economy, a new bill just passed that could directly impact this YouTube channel along with many other Canadian content creators. And that is Bill C-11. Now, if you haven't already heard about this bill, here's a quick overview. Essentially, it allows the CRTC, or the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, an unelected government agency, to force online platforms like YouTube to promote Canadian content to Canadian viewers. As a Canadian content creator trying to grow this as a business for myself, you might think, hey, this probably sounds pretty good to you, right? Your videos, because they're Canadian, very Canadian focused, could get broadcast to a larger audience. But as of right now, there's actually no definition of what content gets deemed as sufficiently Canadian to be pushed forward, right? Does the message of my video matter, or is it just the fact that I'm Canadian? What if I speak negatively about the CRTC, the body that decides whether or not my Canadian content is actually promoted as Canadian content? Now, in an ideal world, the CRTC would make decisions that makes this very broad as to what gets determined to be Canadian content, but you can see how this power could be abused in a worst-case scenario. But luckily, the Senate in Canada made an amendment to the bill that would make it so that this bill wouldn't apply to user-generated content like this very YouTube video you're watching. But the current Liberal government didn't like those changes made by the Canadian Senate, and this is what the Canadian Heritage Minister, the minister responsible for this bill, recently said in an interview.
Things have changed, things have evolved, and the bill has to adapt to the reality.
Are there amendments that you've already looked at that you have decided to reject?
Well, we'll see when the bill comes back, because I can't. It's in the Senate. I don't think the
And they've
senators
talked a
would
lot
be
about
so.
what those amendments are. Yeah.
But there are amendments that have zero impact on the bill, and others that may have some, and those we will not accept them.
So he says he essentially won't accept any amendments to this bill that make it so user-generated content isn't governed by the CRTC, which makes me wonder what's the point of the Senate if they can't make amendments that are actually considered by the government that then has to approve them. But in the context of this video, all of this is just to make the point that the Canadian government seems to be drafting policies that don't optimize it for the true creation of the economy of the future, where individuals often create businesses out of the intellectual property and content that they create online. And this inability to grow the Canadian economy over the long term is demonstrated through one number that actually describes the quality of life in Canada also, and that is the GDP per capita. We've talked about this on the channel before, based on some recent numbers put forward in an OECD survey. Canada is projected to have some of the lowest GDP per capita growth over the next 30 years out of any country. Now, this is a big deal if you understand what GDP per capita means. GDP, or gross domestic product, just describes the overall productivity in Canada, how much money is made by selling goods and services, and per capita just means per person. So on a per person basis, how productive is the individual Canadian? This might sound a little abstract, but this impacts you directly, because if this number is higher, the GDP per capita, or money produced from Canadian productivity per person, well, if this number is higher, the average Canadian quality of life goes up. In general, this number reflects how much money each individual Canadian has per person when sort of averaged out across the entire population. And our growth in this area is rather low compared to some of our counterparts here, with only 0.7 to 0.8% growth of this number each year projected over the next 40 years. Now, one way we can get these numbers to go up more than they're projected to is to focus on more growth of Canadian native companies and intellectual property. If we focus too much on just incentivizing foreign companies to come into Canada and to invest, well, yes, we do get more jobs in Canada, but we fail to capture the real value that those jobs create for the companies that hire Canadians, like patents for new technology that was developed by Canadians, but it is exploited by these foreign companies. Right now, global companies hire Canadians to study these things and develop new technologies, but the real value of this development goes to the global corporations instead of Canadian ones, decreasing our potential future GDP. Now, the current government and Liberal Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland are focused on growing the GDP number, growing the Canadian economy, but they're not so focused on growing the GDP per capita, which is a better measure of the quality of life for the average Canadian. Right now, the Liberal government and the Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, are very, very focused on increasing the GDP because they use this number and how it relates to how much debt Canada has to sort of project whether or not their fiscal plans are actually sound. They want to make sure that our GDP is going up faster than Canada's total debt. But by doing this, they're only focused on the GDP number instead of the debt to GDP number that actually predicts Canadians' quality of life on an individual basis. And it's a lot easier to make the GDP number go up as opposed to the GDP per capita. By increasing immigration targets, which is something the Liberal government has done, we can bring more people into Canada to work, which will sort of drive up that GDP number, but it will drive down the GDP per capita unless we also become more productive, which is something that I think we're focusing on not enough. But obviously we covered a lot today. The government's plans to sort of focus less on spending on some of the things that they promised and instead focus on the green transition, creating a new economy, and focus on healthcare spending. Do you think that this is the right approach given the worries about if they were to spend more on these programs that they promised that inflation would get worse? Or do you think this is sort of just a distraction, potentially not the right way for Canada to go? Let me know down in the comments what you think. I read every single one and I try to reply to a bunch of them. And if you haven't already done so, make sure to subscribe to this channel for more Canadian focused videos just like this one. And with all that said, thanks so much for watching, everybody. I really hope this video helped you out at least a little bit, and I'll see you next time.